Welcome, everyone. Really excited to be here with you all. And welcome to our launch event for Ukraine, Insights and Implications. I am Emily Arnold-Fernandez. I'm the managing editor of Forced Migration Review. And I'm here with our panelists and some colleagues. But first, just to give an introduction to Forced Migration Review. Forced Migration Review's mission is to bring together a community of diverse, knowledgeable voices to share lessons and good practice in forced displacement response in order to inform improvements in the way that we respond to crises of forced displacement. And as probably most of you know, we publish a magazine twice a year that addresses different themes in forced displacement response. And for this event, we are launching our Ukraine issue, Ukraine Insights and Implications, which was released a few weeks ago. So we're very excited to have some of our authors here today to share with you their insights and to talk about the implications. I'm also delighted to be here with some of my Forced Migration Review team colleagues. Catherine Meredith is our deputy editor. And we also have Maureen Schoenfeld, who is here as our support and facilitating some of the chat and Q&A. Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you now to introduce the issue a little more deeply, and then we'll turn to our panelists.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Meredith, the Deputy Editor of FMR. I've had the privilege of working with the authors whose insights are published in this important issue. And I'm hoping that many of them are here today. I actually would just like to say we encourage you to have your cameras on if you're comfortable with that. Hopefully, at least some of you will have received print copies of FMR 72 in the post by now. If you're still waiting, it is on its way. I'd also like to invite everyone attending the event to please introduce yourselves in the chat and feel free to share questions there during the panel discussion, and we'll try to answer them during the Q&A session at the end. We hope you will also continue to engage with FMR as readers, viewers, reviewers, authors, and partners over the coming months and years. It's an exciting time for us as we're developing our author mentoring program, and we'll be launching a new website in 2024 alongside our next issue, which will be on digital disruption and displacement. If you haven't already, please do sign up on our website to receive email alerts so that we can keep you updated with new issues and calls for proposals. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Now, before we move on to our speakers, I'm going to give you a brief overview of this issue, Ukraine Insights and Implications. A key concept in this issue is temporary protection. We will hear more about the EU's Temporary Protection Directive from our speakers Aleksejs Mundt and Emiliya Bratanova van Harten. You will also find articles in this issue on the experiences of Ukrainian refugees outside the EU, in the UK, the USA, and Russia. Author Kalinichenko will discuss a collaboration between members of the legal community to provide advice and information to Ukrainian refugees arriving in Poland, Romania, and Hungary. This links with other articles which discuss the challenges Ukrainian refugees face in host countries around accessing decent work, education, and social and financial services. Still more articles give examples of innovative initiatives to welcome refugees into host communities. Another key theme in this issue is the displacement experiences and needs of marginalised groups. This includes minority language speakers, young people, children, older people, people with disabilities, and nationals of other countries, including Black African students. Author Aleksejs Ivashuk will speak about the particular challenges faced by stateless people in Ukraine. Finally, several articles consider issues that intersect with forced migration, such as gender-based violence, trafficking, localization, well-being, and the role of media, communications, and digital technologies. And of course, there isn't time for me to properly discuss all the articles, and I would strongly encourage anyone who's not yet done so to spend time reading through the whole issue, taking the opportunity to draw on the author's insights, research, and unique perspectives. Now I'll hand back to Emily to begin the panel discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We have with us Aleksejs Mundt, who is the Principal Situation Coordinator for UNHCR in Ukraine. So he's speaking to us from Ukraine. He was previously a senior policy advisor in UNHCR's Regional Bureau for Europe and has held other posts at UNHCR in various places around the world. Prior to joining UNHCR, he's also worked for the International Rescue Committee and was a Fulbright Scholar. We also have Anna Kalinichenko, who is the senior pro bono lawyer at DLA Piper, a global law firm. She's a Ukrainian lawyer with a specialty in banking and finance law and has worked both in-house as a corporate lawyer and as a senior associate at local and international law firms in Ukraine, but unfortunately had to leave Ukraine due to the war and is currently based in Warsaw, where she's involved in a variety of projects supporting Ukraine and people displaced from the country. Aleksejs Ivashuk is the founder of Apatride Network, a coalition of stateless individuals and communities and stateless-led organizations that are working to address issues of statelessness in the European Union. And he also serves on an advisory board with UNHCR and previously worked for Thomson Reuters and a variety of other organizations in Canada and the US. And Emiliya Bratanova von Harten is obtaining her PhD from Lund University Faculty of Law, and her research focuses on legal pathways to protection and integration in the EU. She's worked as an integration expert at UNHCR in Bulgaria and is interested in the links between integration and temporariness of refugee protection. So with those introductions, we'll jump right into our questions. The war in Ukraine has seen forcibly displaced people forcibly displaced at a speed and scale that hasn't been seen in Europe since World War II. Over 6 million people have fled the country and another 5 million have been forcibly displaced within Ukraine. So the situation has evolved rapidly since the start of the Russian invasion for forcibly displaced people, both internally and abroad. And responses to this displacement, as Catherine previewed, offer promising models, illuminate ongoing challenges, and provide lessons that can inform policies and practices both in the ongoing response to displacement from Ukraine and in other forced displacement and migration situations. So Alex, I'll start with you. You're in Dnipro as we speak. Can you tell us a little bit about the forced displacement situation now, both for people who fled early in the war and for people who may be becoming displaced as the war continues?
Sure, thank you. No, I was sort of thinking to myself how you capture the plight of 5 million people displaced, and it's very hard to speak in terms of generalities. And let me just caveat this by saying I've been in Ukraine about a month, but I've covered it and been traveling here since the start of the crisis. So I've watched sort of various iterations, and now people I think are facing their third winter. Let's consider this the third winter, not the second, because it was awfully cold in February 2023. And I think, how do you put this? At the aggregate level, you have 5 million IDPs, and that's a well-known statistic. I think what's interesting is this year when the interagency, the humanitarian community was looking at people in need for the next year, what's really striking is the balance has shifted to non-displaced populations who have serious humanitarian needs. So the numbers haven't been entirely finalized, but last year's figure of people the humanitarian community was targeting was about 17 million people overall. This year, the number is likely to drop to just over 14 million. But of that, over 8 million are considered to have huge humanitarian needs who are not displaced. So what we're seeing is this sort of residual population of people who were displaced a year ago or after the start of the crisis, who are actually looking for what I would call interim solutions. They're looking to sort of reestablish themselves in displacement. They haven't necessarily given up their dream of eventually returning, but it just seems like that's not realistic in the short term. So how do they sort of live with some degree of dignity and inclusion in these host societies, which has a degree of permanence at the moment? And how do we, you have over 100,000 people still in collective sites, sort of in every oblast. that are now the government is sort of trying to consolidate and transition. But at the same time, these sites, which sometimes host 40, 50, 100 people, they've formed self-help communities. And, it's a mix of really elderly people, disabled people, and then some more able-bodied people. They've sort of come together and they've filled the gaps and they've helped. And how do you sort of transition people out of collective sites into more durable housing? And how do you also keep, these communities that have formed together? So that's one of the challenges. I think, without over characterizing, I think people, the big question I have is people's resilience. I think, we're now coming into 2 years of conflict, and I think people are tired and they're facing another pretty dire and cold winter with no end in sight. And I think a lot of concerns about how durable the social safety nets are holding up, how much how much longer they can claim additional benefits from the government for being displaced. So some of these subsidies, I think, are really going to come under strain. I think there's a fear. Last year, as we heard, the Russian Federation targeted the energy infrastructure, but it was able to be repaired quite quickly. And it was a pretty mild winter. I think those question marks this year of a lot of the parts needed may not be in country to quickly repair that infrastructure. And I think the unknown is how cold is it going to be? But really, in terms of new displacement, I would say the trend of those people who I said, the 8 million people who are non-displaced but in humanitarian needs, they may be short-term displaced. So they're fleeing up, but they really want to stay close to home for a variety of reasons. So we're not seeing huge, new displacement, even though the conflict continues, but really maybe short-term reactive movements to get out of the way of fighting or evacuations, but then people really want to go back home. But again, I think the big unknown is this sense of resilience, because this conflict has taken an incredible toll on people's family life, their economic well-being, and I think just the trauma that's increasingly evident of a conflict the end doesn't seem to be in view. So let me stop there. I'm mindful of the time. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. That was a really helpful overview of the situation now. And I'd like to turn us to talking about some of the folks who have been displaced for a longer period of time, because both you and Emiliya wrote about the Temporary Protection Directive. I would love to hear from each of you how it has helped refugees, or how it does help refugees achieve some measure of stability, where and how it falls short. And Emiliya, when you also wrote about a slightly longer view of the Temporary Protection Directive and raised the question, what happens when it runs out? So if you each could, I'll let you kind of tag team off each other, but if you each could talk a little bit about that, I would appreciate it.
Who goes first?
Okay, well, if you want, you can continue and then I'll take over.
Okay. I mean, look, I think sorry.
And if our interpreters can make sure they're speaking in the interpretation channel. If our interpreters can make sure they're speaking in the interpretation channel, that way we'll be able to hear the English through the English channel. Thanks.
Well, I mean, I'll go first and I'll try to be quickly because I've spoken quite a bit already. But I think from our perspective, the Temporary Protection Directive did a lot of good. It provided a really, I think, quick legal framework against which refugees could, had a number of rights that they aren't always able to exercise upon arrival. And I think it proved itself, in a way, a very good tool that the EU collectively could agree on, that would really provide sort of emergency protection to vast numbers of people arriving. Just from a perspective of socioeconomic inclusion, the major problem we have had with the temporary protection was the fact that it's temporary in the duration. It was extended in very short segments. And I don't think anybody necessarily thought that the EU wouldn't do the right thing and extend temporary protection, or would be sort of pushing people en masse back across the border. But the problem is it sort of impacted people's ability to be included in host societies in a number of ways that were not helpful. So if if you're an employer and you're looking to hire somebody, are you going to invest in upskilling of skills recognition, or even just investing in a staff member who, when they don't have a legal status that extends beyond 6 months? Banks won't give loans to people because it's not, they have a really insecure status. So in that sense, I think it was, well-intentioned but problematic. So the EU has confirmed the extension, but there's, it gave states a lot of room to openly interpret where they were going to focus and what rights they were going to extend, and a little bit, there was a number of practical administrative barriers that still prevents refugees from accessing the full range of rights. And this is particularly true with accessing social protection systems. The general right was included in the TPD, but it's not guaranteed in various states, and it left a lot of states the freedom to sort of interpret how they would include people. And we have significant numbers of refugees who are still trying to access in national safety nets. And the final thing I would put is it really didn't provide enough guidance on integration programs. So for instance, and this is just a practical barrier, I mean, in our intention surveys, 50% of refugees said, language is crucial for the ability to find a job, but really there's almost very little, particularly in the frontline states, focus on language training is one of the sort of key objectives. But let me hand over to Emiliya there for her take.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's a real pleasure to participate in the launch event and to discuss basically what's happening with the Ukrainian situation currently, but also to look at the future of displacement and possible solutions. So just to add to what Alex was saying and talking about the Temporary Protection Directive, of course, I think there is a consensus that the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time since it was adopted in 2001 was a great step in the right direction. And also in the beginning, after its activation, what could be seen as in other emergency situations, in the beginning of displacement situations, is a very high degree of solidarity and host country populations really providing a great assistance and support to the displaced populations. And that's the idea of an emergency, right? So states need sufficient time to prepare, to set up assistance structures, humanitarian support structures, but now we are no longer in this first phase, and therefore there are new questions arising. So the questions are not so much anymore on initial humanitarian assistance, but we also need to look more long-term and to ask the question, okay, so what is happening with the settlement, with the integration support of the displaced population, and what's going to happen in the future. And naturally also in the course of time, this initial enthusiasm and volunteerism is also dwindling. So the question is even more pertinent: what is the role of the host states? And from that perspective, I was interested in the Temporary Protection Directive, or rather its rationale, because the idea is that the protection is temporary, but we also see in the provisions that the focus is on return. And in refugee protection, traditionally there are three durable solutions, and one of them is return, and the other one is integration, and the third one is resettlement. Recently, in the past months, there have been a few very interesting studies, including by UNHCR, but also Caritas, ICMPD, and FRA, where one can find data on the attitudes of the Ukrainian displaced population regarding their wish to return to Ukraine once the situation would allow for it, or whether they would like to stay. And of course, these are attitudes, so they change depending on different circumstances and factors in the course of time. But as things stand, it seems that about 1/3 or more of the displaced population would consider staying. And indeed, the majority would like to return. But as I said, the focus in the Temporary Protection Directive as it stands is on return. So the question is, what would happen and what is happening to this part of the displaced population which would like to stay? And if we look at the provisions enshrined in the Temporary Protection Directive, indeed, there are a number of socioeconomic rights that Ukrainian displaced population can enjoy. And you all know these include, for example, access to housing, access to employment, access to education, access to social welfare, access to health services. And if you look at that, one can say, yeah, but there are some provisions which help the displaced population integrate. But my analysis shows that this is not enough. A good example of why it is not enough is the situation of, for example, subsidiary protection holders and refugees as regulated in the Qualification Directive, for example, where there is a specific provision on integration facilitation or support. So this provision is not there for temporary protection holders. What does this mean? Well, basically, as Alex said, it means that there is a very wide discretion for member states and other host countries, but we're talking here about the EU, so the member states, to decide how to implement any integration support. So that is a great issue, a problem, I would say, lack of coordination on the ground. We see great differences on the ground in the different countries. And what would help here is, for example, provision of information, but also the setup of some coordinating body, which oversights what is happening on the ground with integration support. And the second issue, of course, is the expectation that these people will return to Ukraine. Somehow, this expectation disregards the reality that there will be a large number of people who would actually wish to stay. And then the question is, what will happen with them after the temporary protection expires? But that's another question. So my article in the issue focuses rather on what integration support is available as it stands. So during the Temporary Protection Directive, and of course that leads us already to some insights about what can happen after the 3 years of temporary protection.
Thank you. That was really helpful, and I think it is. There will be some big questions answered, as both you and Alex have previewed, as we see where the situation goes over time. I'd like to turn now to Aleksejs. When we talk about refugees from Ukraine, I think it can be natural for many people to think about those who are Ukrainian, or to assume that everyone who's forcibly displaced has Ukrainian citizenship in uncomplicated ways. But of course, that's not the reality. And you address this in your article. Can you tell us a little bit about how forced displacement has affected stateless people in Ukraine, and what lessons we might take away from this situation to improve in the future?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So statelessness is a very poorly understood topic. There's not much awareness about it, even within the circles that should be more aware about it, like UN agencies and different state actors and immigration officials. The list is rather long. There's barely any awareness about it, even within the relevant circles. And there's a lot of things to unpack. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of misconceptions, and so I think I'll use this opportunity to unpack some of these things. So stateless people should not be confused with refugees or with foreigners. Statelessness is a particularly vicious form of forced displacement, where you're all of a sudden not welcome to be in the country where you are, but not welcome to leave either. So the pattern of statelessness is pretty much everywhere the same. In Ukraine, it's a bit different of a pattern in terms of stateless people there were not victims of ethnic cleansing or by a dominant ethnic group coming into power to try to take it out on the minorities. Stateless people in Ukraine became stateless due to the collapse of Soviet Union, due to the fact that different former Soviet republics started to implement their nationality laws at different times. And I think all of us can relate to dealing with some sort of absurd bureaucratic issue within one country. So if you imagine a whole bunch of countries all of a sudden not having consistent laws passed, so in Ukraine, actually, quite a few stateless people, they are ethnic Ukrainians, so they're the ones that were sent to Siberia during the Stalin years, for instance, and came back to learn that they needed a propiska, like a registration proof of that, and of course they couldn't provide that. And of course you have the Roma population that face certain discrimination, as they tend to face all the time. So statelessness should not be confused with other sort of phenomena. But we're oftentimes, and I say we because I'm also stateless, but stateless people are oftentimes compounded with refugees. Vast majority of stateless people are actually in situ stateless, so they are on their home territory. That all of a sudden made them not feel at home, to put it in a very nutshell way. Unfortunately, Europe has a long history of making its own population stateless. And it's important to recover these historical lessons in moving forward to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And of course, what's happening in Belarus right now, there's not much awareness about it, but it's yet another continuation of that history. I guess I would stop right there. I know we're short on time, and to just highlight these important distinctions and to emphasize that stateless people are entitled to different category. And of course, just to finish up, that implies also a lack of rights. Originally, actually, the legal term of refugee was closely connected to the notion of statelessness, because when Soviet Union made over 2 million people stateless, the term refugee came about from that situation. Over time, unfortunately, that was forgotten. And now stateless people don't have many access to rights. And if a stateless person can become recognized as a refugee, they are a very privileged stateless person. And I speak even from personal experience because I went through that. It might sound strange to say that if you can become a refugee, that you're privileged, but unfortunately, that's the reality of most stateless people in the world. Thank you.
Oh, it looks like perhaps we've lost Emily just briefly, so I will take over with the next question until she comes back. Thanks, Aleksejs. Next question is for Anna. The issues we're discussing all have questions of legal status at their core. The Temporary Protection Directive accords those under its purview a somewhat different set of rights from those granted asylum, at least on paper. People experiencing statelessness don't fit neatly into legal and regulatory frameworks that define people by their passports, which excludes them from certain rights and opportunities. Your article talks about the role of lawyers and legal services in forced displacement response. What is this role and why is it important?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me at this panel, and thank you for your question, Catherine and Emily. So obviously, forcibly displaced people face a lot of legal challenges on their way to settle down. They end up in new countries, in new environment, without knowledge, local legislation. They don't know how the legal system works, and so on. And this is where lawyers, legal community, or pro bono community, if you want, can step in and provide legal and informational support to those who were affected by the war in case of Ukraine. And in our article that we wrote together with Jasmine from PILNet and Philip from Belil, we are discussing 3 projects that we've managed to implement in response to Ukraine refugee crisis. So the first project is country-level fact sheets, which include information for people displaced from Ukraine in different European countries. We include questions from migration to more complicated tax implications, employment, social benefits, and so on. Those fact sheets were reached by thousands of refugees, but also by the NGOs who work with affected people directly. The second project that we were discussing is the legal educational program, which is called Know Your Rights. It was organized by DLA Piper. And the main idea of this program is to raise awareness of forcibly displaced people about their rights and opportunities in hosting countries, and also to boost their confidence and provide them information how they can advocate for themselves. And the third project that we were discussing is kind of traditional legal clinic. So it is one direct advice to refugees from Ukraine. It was organized by Elil in collaboration with, I believe, 6 law firms in Warsaw. So people can come to the Blue Dot, like this is organized by UNHCR, and receive legal advice on the questions that they have. And actually, why the role of lawyers and legal community is important. The direct legal assistance to people affected by the war is already very helpful, because I know it from my personal experience. When you are lost and frustrated, it is very important to have someone who can help you, who can direct you, who can provide you reliable information on your rights and possibilities. But the other things that we didn't discuss in our article, but it is also important, I believe, is that lawyers and legal community can influence legal framework and policy, because lawyers are those people who work with legislation on the day-to-day basis, and they can see gaps and difficulties that people that refugees face. And of course, they bring the attention of authorities and legislators to those issues. So thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you, Anna. And I think your description of these projects makes a strong case for the importance and the role of legal support in forced displacement response. What lessons do you think we can learn for other displacement situations based on what has worked or what has been effective in this situation with Ukraine?
Yes, definitely. Very good question. And I believe that we need to analyze the work that we are doing in order to improve our future responses. And in the context of Ukraine refugee crisis, we also learned some lessons that I'm happy to share with the audience. And first, and the most important lesson that we learned is around collaboration, coordination, and partnership. We are now participating at the PILNet forum together with Aleksejs, and we are talking about collaboration a lot at this forum. And I really believe it is very important aspect that we need to take into account, because it is impossible to build and scale up projects by one legal stakeholder. So we need to join our efforts, we need to collaborate, and again, in order to avoid duplications and overlaps, we need to use a strategy as much as possible. Other aspects that I would like to mention is replicable and flexible model that we need to develop from the very beginning, taking into account that we can use the same or the similar model in response to other future crises. So we can very quickly use this model without spending too much time for inventing something new. And one more aspect is local context and needs of the refugees. So it is very understandable and naturally when the crisis is emerging, a lot of people want to do something, want to participate. and very often stakeholders, especially not like those stakeholders who are not traditional in this field of pro bono, like private law firms, they omit very important step. It is preparatory work, and we need to take into account that before we start responding to the crisis, we need to identify legal needs. And although you might be very experienced in this field, each crisis is unique, and yeah, we shouldn't forget about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That is very helpful, and some good lessons for us to take away. We do encourage folks to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We don't have too many right now. We've got some great comments, so I'm excited to see those. But we have a few comments, a few questions from the FMR team, so we will continue to ask those. And Aleksejs, I'd like to turn to you. We've been talking about the law and use of legal support for refugees or other people who are forcibly displaced, but of course, in order for the law to be useful, the law needs to be in place. The policy needs to be in place in the first place. So, you talk about in your article about stateless people having a positive impact on Ukraine's domestic policy around statelessness. How might those same groups or similar groups be involved in advocacy around statelessness in countries where people have now sought refuge, for those who have been displaced, and recognizing that of course many or most stateless people are not displaced, but for those who are, how might they be involved in advocacy in the new countries where they're now living?
Of course. So first of all, I would like to point out that's a small minority of stateless people. The vast majority of stateless people, they're not able to leave Ukraine. Like I mentioned, the right to become a refugee is not really granted to stateless people that easily. So it's a difficult question, and many cannot even become IDPs because they're stuck in war zones, because they cannot go through the military checkpoints because you need an orthodox form of ID or papers. Many cannot even get access to humanitarian aid. And so, for those who can make it out, for those who can be brave enough to organize and use freedom of assembly, it is important, I think, for us to do that and to give strength to our voice, to do community building, and to realize that as individuals, we're not going to be heard. We can be easily ignored. So statelessness is not something that's going to be resolved by itself. And with time, my organization, and as well as other stateless-led organizations, we're recognizing that we need to take a lead in being actually involved in the topic of statelessness. For the longest time, this topic has been discussed for us, without us, and that's something we definitely need to fix. And it's only very recently we started to make steps in fixing that sort of injustice, to be honest, because stateless people need to be involved in a topic that directly impacts us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because on the one hand, we're talking about some of the differences between people who are able to become refugees and people who are stateless and not able in many cases to become refugees. But there's a similarity. I'm seeing a similarity in the history of talking about these issues without the folks who are directly affected being at the center of that conversation. And so your points really resonate, I think, across forced displacement and forced migration issues, kind of understood broadly. I'd like to turn now to Emiliya and Alex. Speaking of policy, what do you think needs to happen in order to put in place more effective policies, or to make existing policies more effective in refugees' daily lives, kind of as the temporary protection directive ends? And I know we've talked about the fact that we kind of have to wait and see what happens, but if you could direct policy, what would be the top changes that you would make in order to create a more just and a more ample range of opportunities for folks who are displaced from Ukraine?
I defer to Emiliya to go first this time.
Okay, thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity to start. So I ended my first intervention with the question, what's going to happen after the temporary protection expires. And I continue from there. We spoke about the role of the law, and one of the main issues that I find with the current temporary protection directive and its implementation related to the wide discretion of member states on how to apply it is related to the difficulty to apply the principles of legal certainty and foreseeability. And this is a problem not only from a legal perspective, but it is a problem for the people on the ground. Because the rules change on a very short period of time, on a short notice sometime, very quickly. And even if in many countries there is a platform of information, and sometimes these platforms are established by the government. In other cases, it is more of a civil society initiative. The Ukrainian refugees also have established their information channels, but the information is not streamlined, and this creates many practical problems, but also problems for the people in terms of taking decisions on their future. And so looking at this future, what are the options? Emily, you said that we'll have to see, but still at this stage, a number of options are being discussed. And one of them is, for example, the amendment of the long-term residence directive, which would, if amended, allow for the period for temporary protection to be counted as part of the period that needs to build, so 5 years as it stands, so that the Ukrainian displaced population could apply for long-term residence in the host EU member state, and that would give some certainty of legal status for the person to continue living in the country of their choice, and also to move in other EU member states, which is currently not the case as it stands. The long-term residence directive does not count the period of temporary protection against this 5-year threshold upon which a person can apply for long-term residence. Another idea, which is more of flying in the air, I would say, is the introduction of a special type of permit upon the expiration of the temporary protection, which could be, there is an idea to establish the so-called reconstruction permits, which would allow the Ukrainian refugees to return to Ukraine and also to EU member states. Of course, I cannot give details because I don't think that anyone knows exactly how the idea would function, but the main thing is that it would give 10-year legal certainty for the person to stay legally in the EU member state. But I'm not sure to what extent this idea is feasible or practical. As it stands, I haven't really seen anything being moved forward in this direction. Another idea that is being discussed is the possibility of Ukraine acceding the European Union, but this is also an idea that takes time, and basically in all of these options, I think we're talking about a time horizon which exceeds the 3 years of temporary protection. So I'm of the opinion that there should be another solution. I cannot say which one, but another idea is that the temporary protection directive could be amended, and then this 3-year period could be extended. But I also see some problems with this, because the idea of temporary protection is that it is a transition to international protection, and not turning the temporariness into an uncertainty and undecidedness for a long period of time, which is not in the benefit of the refugees themselves. The most logical development is probably what I just mentioned, the fact that temporary protection as part of the directive was conceived initially as a transition to international protection, which would mean that Ukrainian displaced population would have to apply for international protection. But then we end up in a situation which the temporary protection directive initially was meant to avoid and preempt, that is the overburdening of the national asylum systems. So you see that it seems still, at least to me, that whatever options are possible and considered as it stands, there are so many cons that probably we need to look at something else. And if you ask me, what would you recommend at this stage? I would think that the best approach, which of course will be open to debate once we know what it is exactly, would be a harmonized approach suggested by the European Commission in such a way as to give guidance to the EU member states on how to implement an exit strategy in a coordinated and foreseeable manner. Also making sure that there is no regression in terms of the rights of the Ukrainian displaced population. What would that mean? That, for example, after the expiration of the temporary protection, these same people who enjoyed a certain scope of rights, socioeconomic and others as well, would not end up in a situation which less rights, which could happen if, for example, the transition to international protection is also not streamlined, because asylum seekers in many EU member states have less rights than those currently enjoyed by temporary protection holders. So I see this as the way forward, the European Commission offering such guidance, an exit strategy, an action plan, and then monitor the situation on the ground, even though such guidance will not be legally binding, but still it is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliya. And Alex, we'll turn it back to you to just close us out with your thoughts about that.
Look, I think it's a tough one because really, and I think this has been a concern of UNHCR from the beginning, because at issue here is as we transition out of temporary protection, or the mandate expires of it, these people are still refugees, and this reluctance to label them as refugees from the beginning is just, instead of Ukrainians externally displaced, Ukrainians in need of temporary protection, should not obscure the fact that they fall under for us, the definition of the 1951 Convention, and the prohibition against refoulement is, I think, particularly a concern. Is what's going to happen? Okay, those who have jobs get labor permit, but then if it's not, then what happens? Because I think we're losing. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that the war continues here. And that people still may not be able to return to areas of origin. They may face increasingly over time issues of social cohesion. Should they go back? Different rights. Should they settle in different oblasts? So it's easy to have this mirage of, well, the West is safe. Lots of people are going back. There's lots of pendular movements, but there still is a very legitimate concern about what could happen. And I think these fears have to be recognized. And we really sort of have to remind ourselves that, as they transition out, even if it's a temporary labor permit, they may still have needs for international protection at the end of that. So really, it's a complicated dilemma. I think our view is we need to look at this with as much flexibility. We're looking now at pendular movements where governments, allow with as much go and see visits, people to come and go, family visit, without jeopardizing their protection status in the country, to try to build a sense of confidence, because our intention surveys find that 75% eventually want to return home, so that interest remains strong. But we don't want to arrive at a situation in 2025, where the options, particularly for those more vulnerable, feel they have to go back because the options on offer aren't sufficient, or they're somehow squeezed out because, you know, of sort of the interest of states to keep, you know, those employed or whatever. So I think it's just to say it's complicated, but I think it does need to be looked at through the lens of the 51 protection regime. We have to bear that in mind. So I'll stop there because this could go on for another hour or two. But anyway, thanks.
Yes, I imagine that the challenges and the attempts to find solutions. So we need all of our voices for much longer than we have today. But I would like to just thank all of you, all of our panelists. We've really appreciated your insights and everything that you've shared today, as well as the work that you've done to share your thoughts and research and insights and lessons in the articles. I hope that everyone who's participating will take some time to read our panelists' articles and the articles of the other authors. There's some really important and relevant information in there. And I look forward to continuing to be a part of this community with you all and continuing to move our dialogue forward about how we respond to this situation and to all situations of forced displacement and forced migration.